completely forgot about this, but it's also like a fantasy book. This is yet another World War II historical fiction because there are very few historical fictions that do not take place in World War II. I was like, it sucks that he cheated on you, but he seems like a real douche and you should have left him anyways. Why are you still with him? Hey friends, it's Sarah and it's time for a Bookoplathon breakdown. It's Bookoplathon. It's Bookopoly readathon.
I was like, did you just have like a total brain fart and like not say Bookopoly and say Bookopalon?
No, Bookoplathon. So I saw Kay's Palettes video at the end of August or beginning of September where she said she was going to take part in Bookoplathon by Becca and the Books. And so Becca has like her little like TBR game that she calls Bookopoly, where it's like a Monopoly board but with like book prompts around the edges, and she does that throughout the year, but then in like September and I think maybe another time during the year, I'm not sure, she also has like a readathon, so hence Bookoplathon. And I had never heard of this before. I just saw Kay's video and I was like, oh, that looks kind of fun. And I wasn't planning on doing a readathon in September because I had just done one in August, but I love a good game. And so I decided to actually take part, sort of, on my own. And I printed out the Bookopoly board, Bookoplathon board, and put it in my reading bullet journal. And there are two ways to do it. Like you can choose like a whole TBR ahead of time and like roll them all at once and then kind of go through them throughout the month. But what I decided to do was do a more like as you go sort of TBR. So whenever I finished a book, I would just roll the dice again and choose my next book based off that prompt, and then that way I wasn't confined to like a strict TBR because I didn't know how many books I wanted to read in September, and then I also could like kind of read other books as well, so when I didn't feel like doing the next prompt I could read another book before continuing on. And it worked out really well. I actually ended up reading 10 books for the Bookoplathon and then another I think like 12 or something outside of that. So I think in total in September I read like 22 or 23 books, but that's like way too many books to talk about. So we're just going to discuss the Bookoplathon ones. But it was a really fun way to like pick a TBR, and once again like a pretty low stakes, low commitment way of doing it, so that was also great. So my first roll ended up being a 6, which landed me on the people square, which means I needed to read a book that had people on the cover, or that like mainly featured a person on the cover. For that prompt, I read The Gifts That Bind Us by Caroline O'Donoghue, which is actually a sequel to a book I had read earlier in the year called All Our Hidden Gifts, and it's a kind of like witchy Irish modern day coming of age story. I'm not gonna say too much about the plot of this one because that gives away the plot and the ending of the first one, but this was also really good. It's got a great cast of characters, some great kind of social commentary. I've got a character who is gender queer, gender fluid, and like changes names, and it's just all around like a really cool series. The next one comes out later in the year, next year, I don't know, but I'm really excited to read it. They have beautiful covers and they're just really cool and like good witchy vibes, especially for the fall. So this was a 4-star read for me, really excellent. I'm so excited for the next installment. So after I finished that one, Parsnip was very interested in what I was doing rolling these dice, and so she decided to help me out, and she ended up rolling another 6, and I ended up on the poll pick square. So that means that I had to put out a poll on social media somewhere and then let social media people decide what I read. So I put out a little poll on Instagram of a few romance books that I wanted to read. The Instagram followers ended up choosing Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. And that is a contemporary romance where we have a successful doctor from the big city who ends up like in the ditch and gets helped out by a local small town man. They end up hooking up, and then they kind of have this like no strings attached relationship where they just hook up and like go out and stuff, but aren't in a committed relationship because they live far apart. They're from different worlds, all that sort of stuff. This was really cute. It was not super spicy or anything, and it had a very adorable baby goat in pajamas, so that was a definite bonus. This one was also a 4-star read for me. It was just like a really cute romance, exactly what I needed. My next roll was somehow also a 6. I think maybe these dice are rigged, but that landed me on the favorite setting square, which I chose as like the Regency era because I do really enjoy Regency books, and I keep looking for ones that aren't Bridgerton because Bridgerton's very meh, but I just love the atmosphere. And I ended up reading The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This one was like a 3-star read. It was really slow, and towards the end it got a lot more interesting, and I was really invested in the relationship. But at the beginning, everyone was kind of a dick. Like, it's like, there's a guy, and he ends up running into like his long lost love, who he said like, wait for me, I'll make my fortune and we can run away together, and she did not wait for him. So he's like upset at her, and he's trying to get revenge on her. So he ends up courting the cousin who's staying with her. She's like from the country and is like trying to kind of make her debut into society and get all fancy and refined. So he's like dating her, and she's doesn't realize this is a revenge plot on his side, and so she's falling for him, and it's just a big mess. And it was just a little too slow for me, and a little too difficult to root for a lot of the characters, just because they were just so mean to each other, and they didn't treat each other with care or anything. So I just really struggled with that, which was too bad. It also, I completely forgot about this, but it's also like a fantasy book. Like, they have magical powers to some degree. So like, he's a magician and he's got telekinesis, and like the cousin also has telekinesis, so he like helps her learn how to use her powers. But the magic's not really a huge part of the story. So I don't know. Like, you could have taken the magic out and it would have been the exact same story. So I don't know, it didn't really add as much as I would have thought. Parsnip sort of helped me with my next role, but couldn't quite commit to it, so I ended up doing the role myself, and it was actually a 10. We're making progress, no longer stuck on the 6s, but this got me to the mood read square, which was a little unfortunate because I was like, oh, I don't know what to read. I will use my Bookoplathon board to like force me to read something, and instead it was like, whatever you want to read. And I was like, no, this is the issue I'm having. But I ended up settling on Scribbles, Sorrows, and Russet Leather Boots, The Life of Louisa May Alcott by Liz Rosenberg. So this is a biography of Louisa May Alcott, who is the author of Little Women. And this was I believe like aimed at like 9 to 12-year-olds, but it didn't read young or anything. It ended up being like a 3-star read for me. It was, parts of it were like really interesting, parts of it were very dry and like repetitive. So it's like, oh, they needed more money, so Louisa wrote a story, and then they had to like move because the dad was doing weird stuff and people didn't like him, and so they had to like move over here, and like, I know it's like, it's someone's life and you can't make stuff up and all that, but I think if it had been more in-depth, it would have been more interesting. Like, if there was more space between those sections that felt so repetitive, it wouldn't have felt like that. But unfortunately, because it was like aimed at a younger audience and like less in detail and like in depth, it ended up just kind of feeling like, and they're moving again, and everyone hates them again, and they have no money again, which was too bad. But I did learn some cool things about Louisa May Alcott, and it has sparked a desire in me to like go deeper and read some more of like the adult biographies, and like I actually got a couple books that were her like letters and journal entries from a local bookstore, so I'm excited to delve further into the world of Louisa May Alcott. So my next role, which Parsnip was trying to actively hinder by sitting almost directly on the board, ended up being a 3, which put me on the first person point of view square. So I had to read a book that was told in the first person. I ended up working on a song, The Lyrics of Hadestown by Anais Mitchell. Hadestown is a musical, I think it's currently on Broadway, and it is the retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and it's also kind of about class struggle, and it's set in like a steampunk kind of like 1920s-ish world, lots of very like industrial looking things. And this is, as it says, like all the lyrics from the Broadway musical, but then also each song has a breakdown from the author of the musical about the different iterations of it, because it was originally off Broadway and then it actually came to like Edmonton, for a run, and then it was in London, and then it made its way onto Broadway. For each song, she talks about the progression of the lyrics and the way that she works with other people in the like play, in the musical, on her team to refine the lyrics and like make the story more cohesive versus just like, ooh, that's a pretty lyric, but then like her dramaturge or someone would be like, that's very nice, very lovely, very poetic, but like in a musical, is the audience gonna understand what you mean, or is it too esoteric and they're gonna be like, how does this add to the story? So I thought that was really fascinating because I don't know a ton about Broadway or theater or how any of that works. So it was a really interesting look into not only the production of this musical, but just kind of how the creation of musicals work in general. So it was excellent. It also had some fun pictures in the middle, and I was very happy with this. This was 5 stars. Amazing. Spectacular. Show-stopping. Mind-blowing. So then we were camping, and I ended up finishing my book while we were on the trip and rolling the dice for the next one. And I ended up rolling 10 again. I don't know what's with all these duplicates. It's kind of concerning. But I ended up landing on the lowest rated square. So that meant that I had to go onto my Goodreads and sort my TBR from lowest rated to highest rated and pick the lowest rated book that I had access to at the time to read. And that ended up being Canadians on Everest by Bruce Patterson. This was a book that I had picked up in a secondhand shop somewhere because I love books about Everest and especially disasters on Everest. This is written by a journalist. He used to work for the Calgary Herald, and it's just kind of a collection of different stories about Canadians on Everest. So it talks about like the first Canadians on Everest, the first Canadian and North American woman to summit Everest, and just the different trials and tribulations and their journey. I thought this was a pretty solid book. I gave it 4 stars. I love Everest books, and I think it's probably pretty difficult to write a book about an Everest disaster that isn't pretty fascinating, so I quite enjoyed it. So the next roll ended up being an 8, and that put me on the building square. I had to choose a book that had buildings featured prominently on the cover, and I chose The Forgotten Bookshop in Paris by Daisy Wood. This is an arc for a book that comes out later. When does it come out? Okay, so this comes out October 27th, and I actually got this. HarperCollins were doing like a tour around Canada for booksellers, talking about like their new releases coming up, and I went there and they gave us a bunch of arcs, and this was one of them. So it's got the Eiffel Tower in the background and like the whole city spread out. Those are all buildings, so I thought this fit the bill. This is yet another World War II historical fiction because there are very few historical fictions that do not take place in World War II. And it follows a woman in the modern day who is on vacation in Paris, and she finds out her husband's been cheating on her, and so she decides to stay in Paris while he goes back home. And she's kind of like trying to like find herself again after being married for so many years, and she's in her 40s, I believe. So she's like, who am I as a single person? What am I going to do with my life? And then on the other hand, it follows a man in Nazi-occupied Paris who runs a bookstore, but he's trying to kind of navigate life being like, I don't want to piss off the Nazis and get arrested or killed or anything, but I also don't want to actively aid the Nazis. So it's him kind of trying to find a way to resist them without putting him and his family in danger. I gave this 3 stars. For me, it felt very meh. The characters were kind of stereotypical. There were a couple moments that were like pretty good, and I think if it had just been the story in like World War II, that would have been great. I would have really enjoyed that a lot more. But the modern day story, I just didn't really care about. Her husband was a complete tool. I don't know why she had been with him for so long. There was no redeemable characteristics in him, so it didn't feel like I don't know. I was like, it sucks that he cheated on you, but he seems like a real douche and you should have left him anyways. Why are you still with him? Pretty medium. With the amount of World War II historical fiction books that exist out there, I'm sure you could find one that is more captivating than this. But if you're just looking for a very like typical historical fiction, that'll probably scratch that itch. And there are a couple bookshops in it, so like that's fun too, but not fun enough to make up for how mediocre the rest of it was. Once again, Parsnip was very interested in my rolling of the dice, but refused to roll them for me. So I ended up rolling them and getting an 8, which put me on community shelf. At which point Parsnip decided that yes, she would help me roll the dice after all, but it was too late. And the community shelf was to pick a whole bunch of prompts and kind of like randomize them and let like machine kind of choose one. So I wrote down like a few prompts. I didn't end up making the cards because I was like, oh, if I don't land on this, then I've wasted a bunch of cards. So I just kind of put them in like an online list generator. So the prompts that I came up with, a couple of them were actually from like the Magical Readathon prompts I didn't get to do, and then other ones were just based on books that I had in my TBR. So I had Titanic book, a most recent acquisition, book with the same word in the title as your last read, a secondhand book, a 2022 release, point at a random book and then pick the adjacent one, a book at risk of being unhauled, and then a sequel. And the randomizer app chose the book with the same word in the title as your last read. I also realized that I wrote same world instead of word, but it's fine. That would have been very different, but I did mean it to say word. I started reading one that had Bookshop in the title, and then I was not feeling it at all. So I ended up going for Hospital Sketches from the Civil War, and the word that's the same in this title is the. I feel like that's borderline cheating, but it does say the on both the titles, so I went with it. This is by Louisa Alcott. It is a collection of kind of stories from when she was a nurse in the Civil War for a few months before she got sick and had to be sent home. These are written as though they're by like a character called Tribulation Periwinkle, but as far as I can tell, they seem to be fairly accurate to her time in the war, perhaps with like a few tweaks. And they started out kind of a little bit slow with her like trying to get to the hospital and stuff, and a little bit of old-timey language that was kind of a slight speed bump in my progress. But once we got into her actually like volunteering and like nursing at the hospital, kind of like the middle section of the book, it was very gripping. There's a very moving story of a soldier who ends up dying in her care, who she formed a strong bond with, and it was just really moving and emotional and touching, and honestly some of like her best writing in that like one section. I was like, wow, I was almost crying reading the book, so that was great. It's also like 109 pages, so it's fairly quick to get through, even though some of the language at the beginning was a little old-timey and hard to parse, but I really enjoyed it. I thought this was great. I ended up giving this 4 stars. So my last roll for the month was a 4, and that put me on the emoji square. So I used a random emoji generator, and it selected this play pause button, and then I was like, I don't know what to do with that. So I asked my boyfriend what kind of book that would be, and he suggested an audiobook, and I didn't have any audiobooks, and also it was the last day of the month. But I did have a book about a boy band, and that's music. So I ended up reading Kiss and Tell by Adib Khorram, who is the author of Darius the Grey is Not Okay, and this follows a Canadian boy band, which is really fun, and kind of the lead singer of that as they go on their first like big tour, and he has just broken up with like his long-term boyfriend and is dealing with all the media pressure of that, and then starts kind of fall for the lead singer in their opening band. And so it talks a lot about being gay and being gay like in the spotlight and having to play a version of yourself for other people for your career, and also just like, you know, being a like teenage boy in the spotlight with all these people around you who are trying to manipulate you for the benefit of your career, but not necessarily for the benefit of you as a human. So that was really interesting. I gave it 4 stars. I'd seen some people on Goodreads say that they kind of wished that the main character had had a little more time to be like single and like figure himself out, but instead of like jumping from one boy relationship to another, that he had more time to be single and like be on his own and figure out who he was. And I think I agree with that, but it was still really good, and it was cute and had some good points to make. So those were the 10 books that I read for the Bookoplathon, and I had a really fun time with this. I feel like this might be something that I just use every now and then when I don't know what I want to read next. Just roll the dice and move my little guy around and see where I end up, because there's pretty like open-ended prompts, but they're also just nice when I have too many books to read and I don't know what I want, and then I can be like, well, the game told me to do this, so now I have to. But thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time. Now, Go read a book. I had to choose a book that had buildings on that. I had to choose a book that was having like boyfriend, 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 boyfriend. It's not that many boyfriends. It's like 2. Gotta do the finger guns. The bisexual finger guns.